about the elbow joint? Humeral ulna, humeral radial, and radial ulna. What's the true elbow joint? Humeral ulna.
Is that the skeleton?
Did you
talking?
get it? Did you get it? That's your test talking to you.
Okay.
That's that weird voice your test makes in your
voice.
head when you're trying to take your test.
That's
I'm glad we've got all that straight now. What are the motions of the elbow joint? There really are only two. The elbow joint does flexion anteriorly, as John would say, and extension posteriorly, as John would say. But really, stop doing that, John. You're confusing me. Because when we get to the knee and it does flexion posteriorly, you're going to start saying flexion posteriorly, and I'm really going to get messed up. Oh, I'm going to be so messed up, I'll have to quit. So there's two other motions written down here, and they're called supination and pronation. And guess what the muscles are called? Supinators and pronators. Does that make it easy?
Yeah.
Ain't that sweet? Well, what it primarily involves, and it says it in your book, because I was reading it in Chona's book, on your radius and ulna page, the bones, you know, when we did the upper body landmarks, and you're supposed to read those pages in your book that had to do with the radius ulna. It describes to you that when you're doing pronation and supination, which bone do you think is doing the most movement? Do you see my humerus doing anything?
No.
So with supination and pronation, the humerus has diddly squat to do with it. So they call this, the radial ulnar joint is making the movement doing supination and pronation. Which bone is moving more? Radius or ulna? Your radius is moving more. Hook to your thumb, look at him. Roop, pronation, roop, supination. The ulnar kind of follows it, but the most movement occurs at the radius. So one of your test questions will be, what movements occur at the, get dots all over your phone, at the radial ulna joint, and your answer would be supination and pronation. So elbow joint does what? Elbow joint does what? Flexion and extension. Radial ulna joint does what? Pronation and supination. The supinator does what? Supination. The pronators do what? Pronation. And what are they called? Pronator teres and pronator quadratus. And let's take a look at those pretty pictures. That's my first page. I don't know what your first page is. Pronator quadratus, pronator teres. Teres comes off of the humerus.
Shirley, what picture we're looking at?
Pronator quadratus and pronator teres. Is in your handout. Let's stick with the handout for now. We'll go over all that other stuff. That other stuff is learning tools for you and test papers. This is always, your handout's always going to be like your thing. Mine's on the third page, but yours could be
No,
anywhere.
it's the one you just had. It's just past the Coney's.
Pull that out. There you go.
Third page with 3 on it.
Now, pronator teres on your front page says what? Mid-lateral shaft of the radius to the medial epicondyle of the humerus and the coronoid process. So the pronator teres is the most proximal meaning the most proximal, are you with me? I hate talking to myself. The most proximal pronator muscle. You have a picture of it? Look at it. Because you're going to have to find it on these other pictures. So it's easy to confuse him with some other muscles, but he's longer. So he goes from the medial lateral shaft of the radius to the medial epicondyle. So if he's on the medial side, he causes pronation when he turns. Look at your arm in, what's this called? Anatomical position. Now, what would have to shorten to make the radius go over? So it's on the radius and medial, and when it shortens, but it's on the back side. It shortens, it turns it. All right, here's what we do. Anyway, the pronators are on the anterior, the supinators on the posterior. The quadratus one is on the distal part, and the teres is on the proximal part. Quadratus is kind of cool. He just kind of goes from one bone to the other. I'm not sure that he has any function at all but squeezing the bones together, but they say he causes pronation, so we say he causes pronation. He's on the distal quarter of the anterior radius and ulna. So remember that pronators are anterior. He's on the distal quarter of both bones, so you know the insertions and origins. The other one's where? from the mid-medial shaft of the radius to the medial epicondyle, and when two go together, it causes pronation. See them squeeze together? Squeeze, squeeze, squeeze. All right, we did our pronators. What do they do? Pronation of what? The radial ulnar joint. Supinator, let's do supinator. Supinator. Hello, 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 there you are. Lateral epicondyle, so he's on the opposite side of the pronator. He's from the lateral epicondyle of the humerus, and he goes to the lateral surface of the upper 1/3 of the body of the radius. He kind of wraps around. He's hard to call a total posterior muscle, especially since it says the insertion is the anterior surface of the proximal radius. But I still try to remember that he's posterior, more posterior. Does that make sense? Large muscle wraps around the bones of the forearm. It's covered by more super.